Okay. Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yuttapara Kamalam Sri Guru Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam. Gaura Shakti Swarupaya Rupavanu. What happened was Guru Maharaj went to Madhuban, and Padmanabh Maharaj was there as well. And so for a month, they were giving classes almost every day. And it's a kind of a tall order to come right after that. I think those classes ended yesterday, and then I'm the next right after that. So it's a little tough. It's kind of like the local warm-up act coming on stage after like Metallica and Slayer or something. So here I am doing my set, but this is just what it's going to be, and I hope you guys get something out of it. So I don't know if you were listening in on the previous class, so I'll give a very quick overview of the second chapter of Jaiva Dharma. It was called the Vaishnava Dharma is Nitya Dharma. Let's see, actually the actual title was, Vaishnava Dharma is Nitya Dharma. And in that chapter, Bhaktivinoda was establishing, first of all, what's the eternal function of the soul. And then from there came to the conclusion that Vaishnava Dharma is the eternal function of the soul. And he compared it to other traditions and other distance. And the conclusion was that Vaishnava Dharma is like the purest expression of the fundamental nature of the soul. And in that chapter, after Premdas Babaji had described the kind of like the Vaishnava perspective on Advaita Vad or Advaita Vedanta. After that, Sannyasi Thakur, who was previously a Mayavadi sannyasi and then got a glimpse of the pure Sudhanam from this one devotee who happened to be chanting close to him in Varanasi. He got this bhakti samskar, and he wasn't happy with the Advaita Vad conception anymore. So he started looking for devotees, and then he found the Premdas Babaji in Mayapur, and then became a devotee, but he hadn't fully gotten purified. So after Premdas Babaji had explained to him the Vaishnava view of Advaita Vad, how basically Shankaracharya is an incarnation of Shiva, and there's a whole reason for Shankaracharya's appearance. At that point, Sannyasi Thakur wanted to do away with his sannyas garb and the kind of like the external signs of being a Mayavadi. He had his Mayavadi dress and the ekdanda, the stick with one rod. And at that point, so then Vaishnav Sannyasi Thakur, not Vaishnav, but Sannyasi Thakur mentioned that to, sorry, my phone's on. So Sannyasi Thakur mentioned that to Premdas Babaji, who he had accepted as his guru. And at that point, Premdas Babaji says, I never give any instruction to external things. I only, talk about the Siddhanta and talk about the Lila and so on. Like I don't give instructions on clothing and external things. I did that when I read it. I was like, it's kind of like this essential approach that basically once your heart gets purified and you actually start identifying with being a devotee, then you start dressing like a devotee. And of course, the way that it's played out in the West, it's pretty much the exact opposite. And it's understandable, but I'll just first explain what I mean. Like in the West, what happened and what still happens is that right away when people start coming to the temples, because the Western missions are preaching missions, a lot of times there's this push to like dress up as a devotee right away. And like, it's like the first day in the ashram, you want to be a brahmachari and you're in saffron, you're out on the streets. And it's very much the opposite of what Jaiva Dharma is saying here, which is that first you purify your heart. I mean, it doesn't have to go like that, but that plays out in the book that first you purify your heart, and when you identify as being a devotee, then you change your garb according to your internal sense of who you are. And I remember the first time I was in a dhoti in a public place was when a long time ago, like 17 years ago, when I decided to become a monk, and I came from Finland to California with Guru Maharaj. And so I dressed up. I really didn't it was some kind of like those fancy silk dhotis with all the embroidery and everything on the edges. And so I hardly knew how to wrap it on. And so I wrapped it on, and I had these like trekking boots and like an army. And so that's what came to my mind when I read this thing where Babaji Maharaj says, like, just, wait until you feel like a devotee and then dress like a devotee. And so that was in the previous chapter. And in this chapter, this third chapter of the Jaiva Dharma starts with Sannyasi Thakur chanting Harinam in the night, in the evening. And I think Bhaktivinoda even mentions around 10 o'clock in the evening, which I thought was so funny that he would say at the time of the day. And so then all of a sudden he's chanting, and he has this incredible vision of the Aprakrita Mayapur, like all these like gem inlaid arches and these huge domes and like temples show up in this like dazzling spurti or like a, what would you call it? This dazzling vision. And he has this vision of like Shiva dancing his like the dance of the cosmic devastation, and in ecstasy calling out to Gauranga, and Brahma is praying to Gauranga, and like all these demigods, there's hundreds of devotees doing this like loud kirtan, and he's completely like blown away by the whole vision, and then he faints. And then in the next morning, he throws out his danda. Then basically he reached like bhav for the holy name, or he reached the stage of bhav, and then he was ready to become like dressed like a devotee. So he threw out his danda in the river, and he changed his garb, he put on tilak and started, chanting in ecstasy, and went to his guru, Premdas Babaji. And so when Premdas Babaji saw him, he was of course overjoyed and hugged him. And then Premadas Babaji said, "Oh, Vaishnav Das, my life has become successful because I've been able to touch your body." And that's how he got initiated, like formally. He gave him the name in that like spontaneous moment, Vaishnav Das, which is so nice because he was a Mayavadi sannyasi and now he's like the servant of the Vaishnavas. And so that's how he got his name. And then that same day, the devotees started gathering in the Pradyumna Kunja, which was the kunja where Premdas Babaji was staying. He was the most senior, most advanced devotee in that in those kunjas in Godrum. So all the devotees started coming there and circumambulating the Tulasi plant and singing Harinam and so on. And so Vaishnav Das came as well, and he started rolling on the ground where the devotees had been walking because he wanted to have their foot dust. And people were like blown away, like, wait a second, is that like Vaishnav Das, or are we just mistaking him for somebody else? He's looking like just effulgent. This is incredible. And then they said something like, "Oh, we want to have your association." And then Vaishnav Das was very embarrassed by that because he said, "Here I am, I wanted to get the mercy of the devotees, and now they're praising me, and this is not right." And so then he started kind of putting himself down. He basically said all these things about how unfortunate he had been, that he had been so proud of his high birth because he was from this high class Brahmana family. And that the fact that he was very learned and that he was a sannyasi, all those things had pushed him up in the highest echelon of society, but it made him completely proud. And now that he had the actual spurti of what reality is and how insignificant he is in the whole picture of the bigger picture of things, then he felt this intense humility, and he was just kind of hard on himself, And there was one, and there were these very nice, humble, beautiful, back and forth between the devotees and Vaishnav Das. And then there was this one person in the audience who got disturbed from the exchanges. His name was Kalidas Lahiri Mahashai, and he was this very, very learned Brahmana and a landlord, like a rich, very wealthy landlord. And he had been in this high position of courting all these Muslim royalty and everything like that, but he had never really it never gave him any pleasure. He had this very high status, but he couldn't get any pleasure from it. And so then he started looking out. He somehow ended up doing kirtan. He got into doing Harinam Sankirtan, and then he ended up in Mayapur. And so he was in that assembly. He had come there with this other Babaji that he was staying with at the moment. And he got disturbed because he was still attached to his the Brahminical idea and all these socio-religious ideas about what the structure of society is and so on. And so he was also a skilled orator. He was very good at speaking, so he decided to put out the question, his doubts out there. And specifically what he asked was, let's see, where is it? So he said, according to Manusmriti and other Dharma Shastras, the Brahmana caste is the highest. And according to these Shastras, religious rites such as Sandhya Vandana, which is the Gayatri mantras and the certain mantras recited 3 times every day, are considered to be Nitya Karma, or eternal functions for the Brahmins. If these activities are obligatory, why is Vaishnava behavior opposed to them? So the way he understood what Vaishnav Das was saying was that he was opposed to the Brahminical Dharma, basically, because he was saying that it's just pride, and he's so glad to be done with it. And so all the devotees asked Premdas Babaji to answer, but instead Premdas Babaji said that he would like to have Vaishnav Das answer the question. which was a smart move because, you know, the doubts came from Vaishnava Das's behavior. And basically Vaishnava Das started explaining the whole thing by saying that there are basically two types of, that human nature has like two types of tendencies in relation to religion. And one of the tendencies is Vaidhi and the other one is Raganuga. And Vaidhi, of course, means like the religious rules and regulations for human society. And Raganuga means this spontaneous attraction and love for Krishna or God. And he went on to say that as long as there's any kind of influence of Maya in one's heart, then the Vaidhi Dharma or the Vaidhi path is absolutely necessary, because we need to be regulated from the outside to stay on the right course, because our internal, our desires and yearnings actually pull us away from the path of religion or the path of progressive path towards God. And then within the Raganuga tendency, there's this, it's called Shayon Mukha stage, which means that your tendencies towards Ragatmika, or the final, kind of like final complete severing off of material attachment. But as long as you're tending towards it, it's called Raganuga. And then when you're completely pure and you're actually completely severed from material existence, then that's the Ragat. Terribly opposite way, like we have this natural attraction for matter and for our false ego. And it's really interesting to think that that's our false nature, but because of our like continuous and eternal connection with this false nature, the Bhaktivinoda makes this point that we think that false nature is the actual spiritual identity or the real substance or the vastu of who we are. And so we are Ragatmikas towards matter. It's so absolutely spontaneous the way our attachments and desires kick in when they get agitated. And it's very unfortunate, because consider that our real nature actually is to spontaneously be attracted to the embodiment of reality, or like that's self. So anyway, that's how Vaishnava started explaining, kind of like prepping to make Lahiri Mahasaya understand why the Brahmana Dharma is not at the same level with Vaishnava Dharma. That from this connection with matter, we get this like false ego of I, me, and mine, as is the saying. I am so that like identification with the body brings this sense of possessiveness of whatever is in relation to that body. And then from what comes from that is that we naturally are favorable to the things that give pleasure to our mind and body, and we're naturally averse to the things that give pain to the mind and body. And the terms for that are raga, which means attachment, and dvesha, which means aversion. So raga and dvesh, like everything in our material lives goes between those two polar opposites. And Bhaktivinoda goes on to explain how it like plays out in three different categories, since Bhaktivinoda likes to categorize things, which is very useful. He says that it plays out in relation to the body and it's like extensions and so on, the family and so on, which the term is saririka. And then there's samajika, which means in relation to society and social ideas. So we like the social ideas that somehow give us pleasure, and we are very averse to the kind of social ideas that take away from our immediate pleasure and what we deem, based on that bodily conception, to be beneficial for us. And then the last type of or the last category is naitika, which means in relation to morality and ethics. And also, I think Bhaktivinoda didn't mention it, but that goes as well with religion. So like we relate to the kind of morality or religion that gives our body and mind pleasure, right? I mean, the New Age religions or New Age like spiritual systems are a good example of how they kind of like stroke the ego, not always, but a lot of times, instead of trying to go beyond the ego of the duality of raga and dvesa. I'm sure you've had an experience like that if you've ever tried to convince somebody of vegetarianism. Like one of the most common, when I was younger, when I got into vegetarianism, I was kind of fanatical because I felt like it was the truth or whatever. And so I would, have these debates with people. And one of the most common things they would say, there are two things. One was, I could never give up meat, which means it gives me pleasure, I can't give it up. Or the other one was that it's natural for humans to eat meat, right? But that was just another way of saying I can't give up meat because it gives me pleasure. Because there's nothing that we don't have to eat meat if we don't have to. So that's just a quick example of how that raga and dvesha plays out on the level of ethics and morality. And then Bhaktivinoda goes on to say how the things that perpetuate this faulty sense of self are kanaka, kamini, and pratishta. This is a three-way thing that is used a lot in the Bhaktivinoda Parivar. And so kanaka means gold or wealth or any kind of thing that money can buy. So basically, like you could say wealth or acquisition. And kamini is the sexual pleasure or lust and so on. And then pratishta is the sense of self that you get from getting like status or being appreciated and recognized in society. So these three things, when you put them together, that's pretty much material attachment or bondage in a nutshell. And from that, of course, samsara kicks in because you perpetuate that cycle by having that desire to obtain those things, which just keeps you spinning deeper and deeper into the cycle of birth and death. And then, of course, when the jiva's consciousness is that covered by those desires from those three sources, there's no chance that we can understand the spiritual truths. Chid anurag is the term, or the truths of consciousness, because our consciousness is so covered by all these material influences. What to speak of actually having a truly spiritual sustained experience? It doesn't happen. And so then the question comes, well, what are we going to do? Like, what chance do we have to get out of that? And sadhu sangha, sometimes it happens that through sadhu sangha somebody gets liberated without really knowing anything about the scriptures or actively trying to pursue a life of devotion, but it's very rare. And so then Vaishnav Das goes on to explain that is merciful, and that's why he basically revealed the funny, I was just about to say something about how my internet is bad and just cut off when I started speaking. So it's good. I noticed it at least. Yeah, let's see, where were we? So yeah, so then Sri Krishna revealed the Vedas that give the instructions how to get out of this situation or how to progress in life towards praying. But the Veda is like sectioned into 3 parts, and there's the Karma Kanda, Gyan Kanda, and Bhakti Kanda, and it's all based on people's what their adhikar or eligibility to understand is, like basically what the level of the material bondage is in their consciousness. You know, all these demigods, it seems like it's just kind of random. But the way what Bhaktivinoda says is that the Gita clearly establishes that there's a progression. And basically what it is we first have to come to the level of karma, which will go into what karma in this context means. And there we gradually purify ourselves by following the vidhi to karma yoga, which means that we do action without any personal motive, which is even more purifying. And then from that stage, we go to Gyan. We get knowledge of the self and of this Sambandha Gyana, who God is, and so on. And we have the purity of the mind to actually focus on it and understand it. And that through that purification, we go to Bhakti. So there's 3 different adhikars. There's Gyan adhikar, no, Karma adhikar, Karma Yoga adhikar. Well, that's 4 actually. Gyan adhikar and Bhakti adhikar. And then Vaishnav Das goes on to explain there's different scriptures for those different adhikars. And if we'll stick to the 3 different adhikars, forget about the Karma Yoga adhikar for now. For the Karma adhikaris are the Dharma Shastras. And that all relates to society and like kind of like material stuff, material relationships and how to behave in the world. Then the Gyan adhikaris, their scriptures are the Nyaya or the logic Shastras and the Upanishads and philosophy and so on. And then the Prem adhikaris or the Bhakti adhikaris, it's the Puranas and the pure Tantras. And let's see here. So then Vaishnav Das, he kind of tries to give this comprehensive idea of what karma is and how to look at karma. Like, it's actually a good question. Like, what is activity? What is action really? And let me share a screen here. I did a little bit of a chart because there's a lot of terms here. So, okay. So Vaishnava Das, well, Bhaktivinoda Thakur differentiates between Shubha karma and Ashubha karma. And so Shubha means auspicious. And so there's auspicious karma and inauspicious karma. And within the Shubha karma, well, then he goes on to say how Shubha karma is the kind of behavior or activity that leads to like piety, like sattvic behavior, basically, sattvic action that leads to like a better life. And Ashubha karma is based on, well, any kind of sinful activity that's really based on just wanting immediate sense gratification and this selfish desire to accumulate and enjoy. And so then within that auspicious karma, Nitya karma means the kind of behavior that is like the daily prescribed duties, like exactly what Lahiri Mahasaya was asking about in the beginning, the Sandhya Vandana, Gayatri mantras, and all these prescribed duties that the different classes of society have to perform every day. So that's within the Nitya karma. And then Naimittika karma are these like, what's the word? Infrequent things. The example given in Jaiva Dharma, the rites that you have to perform when your parents pass away, for example. But there's a whole bunch of different Naimittika karma injunctions. And then the last one is Kamiya Karma. It means lust or desire. So it's the kind of activities that you do solely for your own pleasure, but you do it in the context of Vedic injunction and regulations. You do it according to the Shastra instead of just going after it, just straight gratification. And although the Kamiya Karma or the lusty karma, whatever, that's a bad translation, but the karma for fulfilling desires is in the Shubha Karma section, Bhaktivinoda says nonetheless through Vaishnava Das's mouth that we should reject that as devotees because it's not conducive for devotional life if that becomes your focus. And then in the Ashubha or non-auspicious activities is akarma, which means the non-performance of Shubha Karma. So you don't do you don't follow the Vidhi Marga, you don't follow the rules and regulations. And then kukarma means actual sinful activities. And so about so much of what the normal, at least the global Western world is like preoccupied with, it would kind of fall on the Ashubha Karma side in so many ways, because there really is no sense of mostly, for a good part, I should say, there's no sense of acting so that you progressively go towards this more purified state of consciousness. That's not really a focus in the world. And so then, according to the Vedic wisdom, that kind of behavior unfortunately keeps spinning you downward in the karmic or in the samsara cycle. And that's the point that Vaishnava Das is doing here, that when you start on the ladder, when you start with karma, you have to try to focus on the Shubha Karma so that you gradually get elevated, so that your adhikar gets closer to karma yoga, where you realize that whatever desires you're trying to fulfill through the injunctions and stuff don't actually give a whole lot of enjoyment. And let's go back to the notes here. So then the authors of the Vedas started thinking, like, what kind of society, how do you arrange your society so that it supports Shubha Karma, or the good kind of auspicious karma? And they analyzed the different propensities and traits of different types of people, and they came to this conclusion of Varnashram Dharma system that is like engineered to maximize the amount of Shubha Karma that you perform. And of course, I could give a whole class or many classes on how difficult that is to, establish or to do that in the modern world, because it's gotten so far from the ideal of the Vedic understanding of life that if you don't have the core of thinking of like progressing in life towards this more purified state of consciousness, then all these regulations of society just start seeming like these extremely binding and shackling kind of like empty rules. So without the core of having the sense that where life progressively goes towards like a more the Varnashram Dharma can start seeming very restrictive and unnecessarily harsh. And so I can't really go into that because it would take me a couple of classes to really bear down on it. And maybe I'll do it at some point because it's a very interesting thing. But for now, we just have to leave it on the shelf. And so the interesting thing is to really understand how high even the ideal of Varnashram Dharma is. There's a verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam that says, it goes like this: the duties for the members of all the Varnas, all the different classes of society in Varnashram, are non-violence, truthfulness, abstention from theft, freedom from lust, anger and greed, and endeavoring for the pleasure and welfare of all living beings. So imagine if we had a society where all the, constituents of that society would actually adhere to that kind of moral code. I mean, it's like an extremely, that seems like spiritual to us, because we're not, in the West, we're not really used to thinking in, well, at least secular West, we're not used to thinking in these spiritual terms. So that kind of level of purity or sattva is in itself seems spiritual, although it's really just a preliminary thing on the spiritual path. So that just shows it's understandable that Lahiri Mahashaya had some down what karma really is and what the different categories of karma are. And the next phase is, so basically Vaishnava but then he goes on to kind of redefine karma and says that in the absolute sense, really the only nitya karma or eternal function of humans is bhakti. And so that's the only, and everything else is really naimittika karma, or like this more inconsequential circumstantial behavior based on whatever circumstances you find yourself in. But the reason that bhakti is really the only nitya karma is because that's the only behavior that is the same in every single situation. Vaishnavas, they always, their whole purpose of and so from that point of view, he goes on to explain to Lahiri Mahashaya that in that sense, when Lahiri Mahashaya said that the Sandhya Vandana and the other prescribed duties are the nitya karma of the brahmanas, the Vaishnava Das is saying, actually, no, that's all naimittika karma, but it's only nitya karma in this like vyaviharic or like circumstantial sense. And then he goes on to tell to Lahiri Mahashaya that there's really two types of people in the world: the ones that are spiritually unconscious and the ones that are spiritually awake. And in the spiritually, then most people, of course, are spiritually unconscious. That's how the world goes around. And in that sphere, the brahmanas are like the best, you could say, because they have the most purity. But the ones that are spiritually awake, they are bound to behave differently than any of the class of people in the spiritually unconscious category. And the whole point of the Veda is to bring people to the spiritually awake stage. And that's why the Vaishnavas, for example, what Vaishnav Das did just in the beginning of this chapter, he was kind of thrashing the Brahmana Dharma and the Sannyas Dharma. The reason is because that those things are actually very good for people when they're going on the ladder towards purification. But once you're purified, all of that actually becomes a huge hindrance. If you're getting seriously purified and you're still attached to your, like, say, like Brahmana Dharma, then that becomes the binding force that was supposed to be like one step ahead, one step that you use to like go on the next step. You get attached to that one step and you think that's the highest step, and that becomes the step in itself becomes an impediment for you. And you can imagine how puny the question felt for Vaishnav Das, who had just like previous night had this amazing spurti, or this like this revelation of the prakrita nature of the Dham that he was staying in. Like it showed itself in its true form. And he realized his own relationship to God and to the Dham of the God. So he actually like glimpsed reality for a short time. And then he comes down from that. And then this like puffed up Brahmana is asking like, why are you guys opposed to this Brahmana Dharma? The Brahmanas are the best in the world. Like, what's wrong with you? So, it must have been a little difficult to come down from that and be like patiently like go through this whole long explanation of how karma, jnana, and bhakti relate to each other and what's the nature of reality and so on. Another point that Vaishnavdas makes is that although, this is kind of what I said already, but he says it really well. And he says that although Varnashram Dharma and Gyan and so on are meant for purification, they're still, or at least Varnashram Dharma is abundant with materialism, because it has to be, because it's basically offering boons for material conditioned souls for them to be excited to move forward. It's like the classic carrot thing, you dang the carrot and you go a little forward when you're thinking that you're just sense gratification, but whoever is sitting in your back and holding the carrot knows the direction. So the Varnashram system, or you could say Vishnu, through the Varnashram system, kind of knows which direction to go. He's holding the carrot, and people go for the desire, but they actually move forward like that. And so that's what the point that Vaishnavas makes, that actually, if you look at it objectively, the Varnashram system is like abundant with materialism. And that's why it's very inconducive for people who want to go to the adhoksacha, to the like ultimate reality of complete pure spirituality. And really then the last point that Vaishnavas makes, which is a beautiful point, is that really when you are like a Raganuga Bhakta or Ragatmika Bhakta, or not Ragatmika, but Raganuga, when you still have some material, you're still in the material sphere, but your heart is on the other side, the only scriptural injunction or the only rule that you really have to follow it is that you do whatever is conducive for that cultivation, and you immediately reject what the level of our purification is, and then based on that we follow the rules that are useful. And even a lot of the things that are considered to be varnashram, or just what really they are just like universal ethical behavior, is very useful for devotees at the stage that most devotees are at. I just now realized I was sharing the screen forever. Anyway, so yeah. So basically, even for us devotees, the level we are at, it's good to consider, I think, like, what is our level of purification and what are the rules and regulations that are beneficial for us. And probably even in our stage, it's still good to stick to the bhakti regulations. Like, I can't really see much use for even devotees on the level most of us are at. Like, why should we follow all this varnashram regulations if our desire is to go beyond material existence? But I guess now that we don't have a system like that in place, it's good to check in with yourself and just, be kind of introspective about what would benefit your practice and what would become a hindrance. And just like Bhaktivinoda calls it, the Bharavahi approach, where it's the burden of all these rules that don't really support what you ultimately are trying to do. And so then after this explanation, the Vaishnavas who are gathered in the Pradumya Kunj, they're like so affected by it that tears are flowing from their eyes, and they're shouting Haribol and like, blessings unto you. And they just feel this like transcendental bliss from the clear and realized explanation of Vaishnavdas. And Lahiri Mahashai, he still has some doubts, but his heart is starting to get purified, and he's very, very appreciative of the whole thing. And in his heart, he's he says something to Vaishnav Das, really appreciates it. He says that, no, actually, I'm sorry, Prem Das says that to Lahiri Mahashaya that you can come and hear every once in a while from Vaishnav Das. And then his heart, Lahiri Mahashaya is thinking, accepting Vaishnav Das as his guru and thinking, yes, because he's a Brahmana and used to be a sannyasi. So he still has those attachments, but the attachments are starting to get purified because he's recognizing the importance of Vaishnavism for the ultimate, goal of life. And just to wrap this up, then what happens is Lahiri Mahashaya goes back to his kunja with the Babaji that he's staying with. And then it turns out that Babaji has fallen down. There's this lady showing up to the courtyard in the middle of the night. And then Lahiri Mahashaya wakes up in the middle of the night because he's like just can't stop thinking about the stuff that Vaishnava has said. And so he's woken up by his philosophical, drive. And then he hears something in the courtyard and goes out and looks, that's in the middle of the night. And there is Madhava Das Babaji, who he's staying with, and he's talking to a woman. And then the woman quickly runs away when Lahiri Mahashaya shows up. Other devotees, according to Madhav Das's words, are not taking him seriously anymore. And Lahiri Mahashaya gets a little freaked out from it and decides he can't stay there because he can't take the risk that the other Vaishnavas are going to start associating him with Madhav Das's corruption, you could say. And so then he goes immediately to Vaishnav Das and Prem Das Babaji in their kunja and asks if he could stay there. And then Prem Das Babaji gives him the permission to start residing in one of the corners of the kunja. And that's how that chapter ends. And then the next chapter, it's going to pick up from there. And actually this Lahiri Mahashaya character becomes one of the 4 main characters of the first part of Jaiva Dharma. So we will continue there next week. And now if you guys have any questions or comments or anything that came to your mind from this, I'd love to hear it. So please share if you have anything.
Haribol, Gurunistha ji.
Haribol, very good. Good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this class. Super nice, super nice. I have a question about Madhava Das Babaji. You quickly kind of summarized the story with him but why do you think Bhaktivinoda why did he include that whole kind of episode in this chapter? What do you think was the teaching?
Rigo, the internet cut off. Your question was just why did he include the last part?
Yeah, that was my question. That why did he include this part about Madhava Das Babaji and so on?
Yeah, I thought about that. I had two different answers. One is that he needed it for the plot to get Lahiri Mahashaya with Vaishnavas. But of course he would have not had to do it that way from the point of view of like literary, the plot or whatever. But then I guess he really just wanted to emphasize, because Madhav Das, when he gets caught talking to his wife, he says, I'm the last only person after Chotta Haridas who has deserved chastisement by the Vaishnavas. And so it's like this really heavy kind of like, wow, I really screwed up here. And I guess I'm thinking, I think Bhaktivinoda just really wanted to emphasize that it's really important that if you renounce Varnashram Dharma, then you don't play with the Varnashram Dharma, because the whole chapter was about that, right? So that would make sense to me. Like if you actually claim that you're pure and that you can go beyond rules and regulations, this actually came to me just now. I hadn't thought of it this far. So then it must be that you don't mess with it, I guess that would be my explanation. What do you think?
That sounds very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Jai. Anything else?
Hey, Haribol.
Haribol, Haripriya. Back in Finland, huh?
Yeah, back at home. Hey, thank you. I really liked your interesting class.
Thank you.
And I have a question about you spoke about karma, like you made the difference between subha karma and asubha karma. And I found it interesting that this kind of like bad karma or sinful karma kind of, it includes the sinful activities as such, but also, if I understood correctly, it includes like not doing good, like kind of staying neutral or avoiding bad. Kind of like you could also see that that like how should I say this? Kind of like if you stay neutral, if you avoid doing bad things actively, that's already kind of like a good thing. But here I get the feeling that it's still like a bad thing if you're not doing actively good things. I don't know if that makes sense, but it would be nice to hear some of your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, it does definitely make sense. Thank you for the question. I kind of struggled with that whole akarma idea when I was prepping for the class, but that's really nice. I didn't think about it like that, but that's a nice way of thinking about it, that it's being neutral, really, what it is in a way. Well, yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. The way I thought about it is that you avoid following the vidhi instructions or the injunctions, but you don't do any specifically sinful activities. And so I guess then what would make sense to me, why that is in the Ashubha karma part, is that your life is not going to be progressive if you don't follow the vidhi by doing the good activities. So even though it's neutral from the point of view of that you're not doing sinful activities, themselves, it's stagnant, and it actually doesn't create auspiciousness in the form of spiritual progress. That's best I can do with that. Does Brigu have any? Can you hear me? Okay. Brigu has nothing to add. Okay, anything else? Okay, seems like that's it. Well, I guess we'll be back next Friday, and I hope to see you all there. Oh, here next Friday. Vaishnavinda ki jai. Haribol.
Gurunistha.